think it's on. And if you are absent, I mean, I'm going to try to integrity these things. Not all the time, but if I'm going through a PowerPoint or something like that, I think it can be helpful to integrity stuff. And let's see. Okay, so one of the things that really characterized what these philosophers were doing is they were trying to explain things in terms of natural forces without bringing in the agency of the gods. And, well, I think that's all that I'm going to point out right now. But let's look at some of them. We want to look at Thales. I've heard that a more accurate pronunciation, and I don't know if somebody's ethically Greek, maybe you can weigh in on this. I had enough Greek in college to get me in trouble, but more reading Greek as opposed to speaking it, reading it as classical language. And so I've heard pronouncing it Thales is probably a little bit closer to right, but these pre-Socratic philosophers, in fact, let me take it back. These dates are to be taken with a grain of salt. We don't know that all of them are accurate. And also, I'm not a big stickler for dates. I mean, you want to know about when these folks wrote, that here you're in the 7th century BC or BCE, if you prefer that. But what does the C mean at the beginning? Circa. Which
means around about that time.
Yeah. In other words, it's saying we don't have it right on the nose, right? Yeah. Very, very good explanation for that. So the circa means these are approximate dates. We maybe can date Thales a little bit better than some of the others because we think he accurately predicted an eclipse, and we know that it happened 585 BC or BCE. Now, I don't know, from what I've read on this, when they say he predicted an eclipse, I think it's a little bit different than what we talk about in predicting an eclipse where they have it down to the minute. Probably, came within a day or two. The people who speculate on this don't think that he got it down to saying it's going to be 3:45 in the afternoon on this particular day. But at any rate, so many of these philosophers had interests in addition to just straight philosophy. And how do we know what they believe? Did anybody over the weekend try to go to our library and check out one of Thales' books? We know that's a trick question, right? Because, well, first of all, you wouldn't do it, even if we were open. But what survives from some of these people? Do we have complete books? For most of them, the answer is no. I mean, this is so early that literally most of what they wrote has been lost to history. We have some literal fragments, pieces of papyrus. And how else do we know? The first line there. I mean, basically, apparently some of their works were around in Aristotle's time, Aristotle being Plato's number one student. And so even though they don't survive today, in Aristotle's time, at least some of them seem to have been around, and he was had a great interest in science, wrote books on physics and botany. In fact, some of the botanical classifications that we even use today are ones that Aristotle came up with. So Aristotle writes on some of these. We know something about what they said because there's some literal fragments, but Aristotle has also quoted and paraphrased some of what they believed. And so that's kind of how we know. One of the chief problems, and one way that intro courses, one of the things I said on the first day is that there's more than one way to teach an introductory course in philosophy. And a way that I didn't mention, but that was very popular in the late 19th and early 20th century, was what was called a problems approach to philosophy. In other words, introducing the subject by focusing on at least half a dozen of the perennial questions or philosophical problems that philosophy has dealt with over the years. And one of these was the problem of the one and the many. When we look a little bit at medieval philosophy, there's the problem of universals, which really was just a rehash of this discussion on the forms. There's the problem of free will. How can we know that our choices are free? And particularly, how can we know that we make choices that are free enough for moral responsibility, that we're responsible for our actions? So the problem of free will, another perennial problem. You go into the modern period after Descartes, and you get problems like Descartes' mind-body problem. He defines immaterial substance, which is what the mind or the soul is made of, and material substance in ways that make them so different that it raises the question, well, how can they causally interact in the way that we think mind and body interacts, right? I mean, I think I'm going to raise my right arm, and, that action, if I stub my toe, a bodily event would cause a mental event. Well, commonsensically, we know that happens, but how does that come about? So you have things like the mind-body problem, and also the problem of other minds. How do we know that there are other minds besides our own if we don't have the same kind of privileged private access to other people's minds that we do to our own? In other words, I can say, well, I know I've got a mind because I have privileged private access to the contents of my own mind. But how do I know that you have a mind? Well, by analogy from your behavior. And the rest of you are sitting there saying, well, I know I have a mind, but I'm wondering about Morawski up there. Well, at any rate, now I know that's a tangent, but what I'm trying to say is throughout the history of philosophy, there have been these perennial problems that philosophers have struggled with. And one way that they used to build a whole introductory course in philosophy is to focus on the problems that philosophers struggle with. But one of the earliest is the problem of the one and the many. Is reality ultimately one type of stuff, or is it irreducibly many types of stuff? And the prevailing view that apparently was around, at least most of the people who write on this subject think the four-element theory was around. Now, when I was in college, there was a group around called Earth, Wind, and Fire that named their group after three of those four elements. But you see, one of the things that the Pre-Socratics tried to say is, well, okay, here's this view that's around in the society that there are four elements, earth, air, fire, and water, but can we do better? You know, if we really knew, had a deep insight into the nature of reality, would we find that that there's really ultimately one kind of substance? And so the Pre-Socratics were very preoccupied with issues in what we call metaphysics, in the branch of philosophy that deals with the nature of reality. And Thales basically claimed that everything is ultimately one of those four elements, ultimately water. And, you know, we can look at it and say, well, okay, he was obviously wrong. Well, he was wrong, but was he obviously wrong? I mean, if you put yourself into his day, I mean, one of the things that you would want from a basic substance is that it has to have the ability to take on many forms. If you're going to say that everything is ultimately this kind of stuff. I remember, I'm not trying to criticize anybody's work in fast food, okay? But I remember a comedian once, he was talking about going to McDonald's, and he was saying that his suspicion was that in the back there was really only ultimately one kind of stuff, that everything that came out of McDonald's was made out of, you know, so that boom, there's a hamburger, boom, there's a bun, you know, boom, there's a fish sandwich, you know, and boom, the same stuff, there's a styrofoam carton to put it in. You know? Well, but this is kind of what these folks are saying, that everything is ultimately a form of water, and if you think about it, it's not a bad candidate, right? There are three obvious forms that we don't need special equipment to know that water can be a solid or a liquid or a gas. And I remember I had an old wood stove, and sometimes you'd have a log and you'd be trying to put a log in the wood stove, and it will have snowed, or it was on the edge of the pile, and even though it was covered over, it had gotten some snow on it, and you put it in there, and you look at what's coming out of the chimney, very hard to tell. Smoke from water vapor coming out of it, you know. And we also know things like that, what the biologists tell us our bodies are about 70% water, and if you take isn't a cucumber, what is it about? It's somewhere over 95% water, you know. So I mean, and one of the things that Aristotle thought was that because it's necessary for sustaining life, you know, this was a good candidate. And I think I have that in the next slide. So, so Thales speculated that there might be less obvious forms of water, you know, and so it's the ultimate substance. And as I said, Aristotle notes that water is necessary for nourishment. I mean, nowhere has that been highlighted recently any more than what has been happening in the Midwest, in the drought. You know, I mean, a lot of these plants not able to survive because they haven't had enough water. You know, so Aristotle says, well, this might have been another reason why Thales chose water as the ultimate substance, that it's necessary for biological life. Now, here we get into an area where we don't know exactly what they meant. Now, the first time I read this quote, I thought of primitive animism, but your books try to steer away from that. In other words, one of the things that Thales said was that all things are full of gods. Now, again, in primitive societies, they think that spirits inhabit what we think of as inanimate objects, like a spirit might inhabit a rock or a tree or a stick, But the way this text, and this is slightly different from what your text says, but I think it's a very credible way of looking at it. But again, it's speculation, is that one thing he may have said is he may have been emphasizing the fact that within things themselves you find a principle that's adequate to explain the phenomenon, the natural phenomenon, within natural phenomena themselves. And you don't have to go outside of it, like Socrates was trying to do in Aristophanes' satire of him. Well, Socrates wasn't trying, but his interlocutor was. So the slant that some interpreters put on this quote of Thales is that things have within themselves a principle that explains why they are how they are, and that we don't have to look outside of natural phenomena, and appeal to the agency of external deities, that the gods are in there themselves. There's a force in there. At least that they were moving in the direction of seeing that they need a kind of a force in things. So we're not going to say a lot more about Thales, except that he was actually part of a trio of philosophers that came from the island of Miletus, or from the area of Miletus, and Anaximander was a pupil of Thales. And as happens in philosophy, sometimes you get pupils who agree with their teachers. Sometimes you get pupils who disagree with their teachers. Aristotle was far and away Plato's brightest pupil, but they disagreed over some fundamental things, and probably because of that, in internal politics, Aristotle, who would have been the likely choice to succeed Plato as the head of Plato's academy, was not. He had to go found his own school of philosophy. But at any rate, so in one way, Anaximander tends to reject the four-element theory. And there's a story that Russell, in his introduction, in his history of philosophy, speculates that Anaximander, some scholars think he made a trip to Egypt and Mesopotamia. I think that's entirely possible. We don't know for sure whether he did, but there are some elements of Egyptian and Mesopotamian creation myths that seem to have influenced Anaximander. At least this is my own opinion. and it was part of those creation myths. They view things as coming from a kind of pre-existing sea of existence. It's very different from what you get in the monotheistic tradition of creatio ex nihilo, or creation from nothing. Everything is thought of coming out of a sort of primordial sea of existence in Egyptian and Mesopotamian creation myths. And Anaximander seems to say there has to be a kind of more fundamental level of existence than just what I call the big four, or the top four, earth, air, fire, and water. That ultimate reality has to be something more fundamental than that. And he's got some reasons why he doesn't think, in other words, why he disagrees with someone like Thales, who would pick one of those four elements and say, well, everything is really a form of that substance. He says, no, that wouldn't happen. If everything were ultimately water, water would take over and there wouldn't be things. And also, so he doesn't think that they can change into one another. He thinks that if one were predominant, then it would have ultimately taken over. Now, I go into this. Some of these elements were paired as opposites, and that's in the next slide. But Thales uses, not Thales, but Anaximander uses a Greek term that gets translated in a number of ways. Boundless, indefinite, or unperceived. And that it basically is something, the apeiron. And so he says, this is the term I'm using to refer to ultimate reality, and it's something more fundamental than earth, air, fire, and water. And, in the next slide, these elements were often thought of as pairs of opposites, the hot and the cold, fire and earth, and water and air, water being the wet, air being the dry. So the thought is, you're not going to get opposites changing into their opposite. Instead, they would tend to cancel one another out. And so he would say, well, why wouldn't we have that? Why wouldn't we have a kind of cancellation effect rather than one substance taking on the forms of even its opposite substance? So he says, look, ultimate reality has to be something more fundamental than these. Now, don't worry too much about this. This is not from your text. I probably should have deleted this slide. But one thing they say is it's not, the boundless has no beginning but is a beginning. But it's sort of the beginning of all things. And again, Bertrand Russell talks about it as being a sea of existence, or a being with a capital B out of which everything comes. Now, it's interesting, though, that, and I think the text that I use makes this kind of clear in ways that, because it goes into it a bit more detail. Your text talks about a vortex, but if you think about it, anyone use a centrifuge in chemistry? I mean, a bunch of liberal arts majors in here, right? I mean, what happens basically? You
separates out the chemicals from, separates whatever it is. The speed of it makes one, more dense stuff go to the outside and less dense stuff stays towards the middle.
Right, right. So it does kind of separate things out. And this is kind of what they think is the sort of metaphor that Anaximander was using, that somehow in this undifferentiated sea of existence exemplified by the apeiron, the boundless, all things are somehow present in it, but they're not differentiated. But that the way they get differentiated is similar to what you find in a centrifuge, although it's not quite that, because in a centrifuge, like you say, the more dense stuff goes toward the edge and the less dense stuff is in the middle. But he sort of pictures a vortex where and this is, I think the vortex symbolizes the whole motion of the universe. Remember, these are still, people are thinking Earth is at the center of everything. The whole universe is revolving around it. And so the circular motion somehow separates out elements, and so you get a world order, with Earth, or the heaviest thing, at the center, and then water, the next densest or heaviest things on the edge, and then air above it, and finally an outer layer of fire. And so, he sort of pictures then elements being separated out in this way. And so his take then on the stars is what? I mean, what does he view the stars as? I mean, he sort of thinks that there's an outer covering that separates this fiery layer from air, but that the covering has like pinholes in it, and so what the stars are is, you put pinholes in a black thing and the light behind it, and you see the light coming through, and so the stars represent light coming through from the fiery layer on the outside. So I mean, you have a kind of a whole cosmology going on here in Anaximander. Now, basically, I thought I would concentrate on the philosophers that are in your in this PowerPoint, but basically, when you have a philosopher, and this is something the 20th century philosopher Richard Rorty pointed out, and I was at Virginia for a while when Rorty was there, and he said, if you have a philosopher, and he wasn't talking specifically about Anaximander and his use of the word apeiron, but he was making a general comment about the use by a philosopher of what seems to be a very deep term. And of course, you get people like the existentialists throwing these terms, going nuts with terminology. And when you have a philosopher who uses a word like apeiron, there's kind of two ways you can react. You say, wow, In other words, one of the things that Rorty pointed out is that you can either think that a concept like that is deep. In other words, the concept of the apeiron is just too deep for me to get my puny mind around. Or, Rorty says, another way of looking at it is you could take a concept like that as being empty. In other words, that it's something that appears deep, and the use of that concept by somebody seems to indicate that they have this deep insight into the nature of reality, when in fact they're using a concept that is empty, that has little or no meaning, and they only appear to have a meaning, and maybe those who use it don't even know what they mean. And this is not just something that philosophers in our present day notice. Basically, Anaximander, and we're not going to say much about Anaximander because I wanted to kind of stick to the ones that I have on the PowerPoint. I may put them in. We do this again out of this text, but Anaximander was Anaximander's pupil, and the latter way of looking at this was kind of the way Anaximander looked at Anaximander's use of the boundless or the apeiron. His view was, that's just a little too mysterious for me. And so he goes back to the big four. But now he's got to contend with the claim by Anaximander that you can't have one of these changing into the other. And the way he tries to solve the problem is by saying that everything is air. Fire is air, spirit is air, soul is air. And he brings in a force, condensation and rarefaction. And so, to show how Anaximander was really wrong, and everything can be a form of just one of these elements, he says, well, if we use condensation and rarefaction, some things like air and fire are extremely rarefied forms of air, but then water is a more condensed form of air, and if we condense air even more, we could get earth or even stone. In other words, he tells this story of how everything that exists can be seen as ultimately air, Anaximander does, if we think of the things we see as being either thinner or thicker forms of air, And so he brings in a force, condensation and rarefaction, to try to explain how everything can be a form of an element that you and I are in touch with, that we know, and he kind of dispenses with this idea of a primordial sea of existence that's boundless and indefinite and indeterminate and beyond the senses, which is where Anaximander went, And so you get kind of a give and take of these Ionians. Any comments, questions? Can you kind of see where they're going then with some of this? And I think I always like the comment in that video that Sir Kenneth was a very, very famous Greek scholar. No, I doubt if he's still around. That video is kind of old, and he was pretty old in that video. But, he says, well, whether we think what they said was wise or silly, and even if, from our perspective, we can say, well, what they said was just factually incorrect. Everything is not ultimately air, or not ultimately water. Still, they're getting an explanations that basically are of a scientific kind, that are trying to explain things and why things are as they are, why we have an ordered, cosmos in naturalistic terms, in terms that just talk about things and substances and forces acting on them, and leaving out the agency of supernatural deities. Well, what time are we? I may go on to the next. So at any rate, probably oughta. Anaximander and Anaximenes and even Thales, while they had some very interesting theories, their views were not as influential on some of the philosophers who followed them in the history of philosophy as were the views of the next two. And as often happens in the history of philosophy, you get philosophers taking exactly opposite views of things. And Heraclitus and Parmenides took exactly opposite views of existence. Heraclitus arguing that basically everything is like a video, that reality is in constant motion, and so much so that things aren't even self-identical. That everything, as Plato later said, in this world is in a constant state of becoming. It never stays around to be what it is. In other words, that things are in such ceaseless change that they don't even stick around to be self-identical. And that point was made in one of the famous quotes that is associated with this philosopher, that you can't step in the same river twice. And to a certain extent, it both is and is not true. But you can see what he means, right? I mean, suppose you're on a riverbank and you put your foot in, right? And no matter how fast you are at putting it in there again, what will have happened? The waters will change slightly from the first time you put it in. And if they have changed, then in some literal sense, it's not the same river because it has changed from the time you originally stepped in it, no matter how fast you are. And so, Heraclitus is known for his famous quote that we can't step twice in the same river. So, a river illustrates his view of ultimate reality, and that is that nothing is stable. Everything is in a constant state of change or flux. And we certainly see this with a river, and so you can never step twice in the same waters because they will have changed. So the word to associate with him is constant change or flux, And his view of reality then still has a kind of mysterious aspect to it because he thinks that even though things are constantly changing and even have opposing opposites, still things can preserve their identity throughout change because we do have a way of speaking of the same river, right? If you say, we went tubing over, the weekend, and I say, well, where'd you go tubing? Sorry. And you say, well, where'd you go tubing? And you say, well, the Gunpowder River. I say, oh, yeah, well, that's the same river we used to go tubing in when I was in college. Well, okay, it's obviously not the same waters, but, within the bags, it has the same name, it's the same river. So, his view, yeah, I think I've got a message. I don't know what makes me feel that way. Throughout the constant change in the waters, though, the river preserves its identity as the same river. And he thinks this is also a sort of picture of the way things in the world exist, that you can have constant change, but there's a sort of underlying unity. And he used the word logos to refer to that underlying unity. Again, translated as word most often. So for Heraclitus, there's like a kind of oneness in difference, and even among opposites. The Greeks and even Socrates, you get a lot of discussion in Socrates about opposites. We're very fascinated with the idea of opposites. And so you say, well, it's the same pen, but the same pen can draw both straight and crooked lines. These are some examples. And he actually talks about water, and, water is in other words, here we have the same thing, but it can have two diametrically opposite properties, right? The same water can have the opposite properties of being both healthy and unhealthy, right? Healthy for fish, since we can't live underwater without special equipment, unhealthy for humans or anything else that breathes air. And this was actually one of his examples. Likewise, another example he gives, and again, sometimes it's hard to feel the force of why he thought this was the deep insight. But he thought that the same road, you take a road that's going up an incline, like going up a mountain or a hill, well, the same road can have the opposite properties of being a road that's going up or a road that's going down, depending. And so he thought that even though reality was in this sort of constant change and flux, you still had a kind of oneness underlying this constant change and flux. Now, did he have a candidate for the ultimate substance? Now, this is something that people kind of debate. In other words, he talks about fire. But think about, think about a fire in a fireplace, right? Isn't it very similar to the waters in a river? Especially a river where, they're being blown around. In other words, the fire never stays still. The flames are constantly leaping. And so he talks about fire, but, the question is, did he view fire as the ultimate stuff in the way that Anaximander viewed air as the ultimate stuff, or Thales viewed water as the ultimate stuff? And I don't know, experts that write on this tend to disagree. What seems to me most plausible is that he took fire as a kind of metaphor for constantly changing reality, because you look at the fire and it never, it never stays still. So, so you would say, well, maybe he used fire as symbolizing, this constantly changing, never static, always in flux world order. And that, to me, is the most plausible way of looking at it. But, one of the things that your book points out, and here we get an agreement between Heraclitus and Anaximander, about the outer layer. That it's an outer layer of fire, but it's also where the gods of Mount Olympus supposedly live. So one way of looking at it is rather than saying it's the predominant main stuff, like Thales did for water or Anaximander did for air, you can say, well, fire instead is a kind of metaphor for not just a world order that can be in constant change, but also a world order where fire is thought of as being eternal and divine, and in the outer divine layer where supposedly the gods live. And even Aristotle, thought that things in the heavens were changeless and perfect. And it took scientists a long time to overcome that, because you have somebody like Galileo, and he turns his telescope on the moon, and it doesn't look like a flawless, perfect object. You don't have, you turn a set of binoculars on the moon, right? The thing's pockmarked with craters. But Aristotle, supposedly, and influenced by these early theories that the outer layers where the gods live and things in the heavens are eternal and perfect and divine and changeless, and you look at the moon and it doesn't seem like that's the case. And how is it that So, at any rate, now his trial, and I had this illustration in a logic book I was using. When Galileo was having to defend himself, they said, well, look, Galileo, you're wrong. You may see a lot of craters and things on the moon that make it look like it's not a perfect sphere, like it's not a perfect object. But what you don't understand is filling in those apparent imperfections is a crystalline, unperceived layer of stuff. And it's really utterly smooth. And so the moon is a perfect sphere. Little you know Galileo. And so Galileo is reported to have answered this very bad argument by saying, you know what, you're actually wrong about that. Because what I know is that this crystalline material, this unperceived crystalline material, actually has a lot of mountains and ridges and valleys, and it's not perfectly smooth. Well, of course, the answer is who can establish one way or the other when you're talking about a theoretical, unperceived, mythical, crystalline substance, but still, this idea that somehow things in the heavens are absolutely perfect is something that took people a while to get over. So one way of looking at this is fire is also this outer layer of reality, and it's where the gods live, and so it's where that which is eternal and divine lives, although he would say ever changing. And so, that's one way of looking at it. Now, it's interesting that he thought that you need attention, and here we get opposites brought back in. He sees the world order as a kind of tension between conflicting and especially opposite forces. So he says, you could have a oneness, but you've got many, and especially you've got conflicting opposites. And I mean, you've got some of these are his own examples. A lyre, L-Y-R-E, the musical instrument. You need attention on the strings. I mean, if you play a guitar or something like that. I mean, in another life, played a lot of guitar, but not much lately. You're not going to get good music unless that string has certain tension. So, in other words, that opposite pole, gives it the tension that it needs. So some more, again, if we go back to the ever-changing river, you've got the waters ever-changing, but there's sort of a constant tension between the force of the river's waters and the containing banks that allow it to continue identically as the same river, and so he says it's this opposition that makes a river a river. Again, a sort of tension between opposites, the water wanting to push out this way, the banks wanting to keep it in. Likewise, he talks about the resistance of a sculptor's chisel on stone. You have to statue, you know. And so he criticizes Achilles, and there's a long quote that he quotes Achilles, but basically what Achilles was, you know, if you saw, I mean, there was who starred? Was it Brad Pitt? Who saw? There was a movie about Achilles that I think was on the theaters a couple of years ago. Yeah. Well, I mean, apparently one point, you know, so here's Achilles, and he's a great warrior, you know, but like a lot of soldiers, I mean, yeah, you know, I mean, the old quote is that nobody hates war worse than, you know, a soldier or a warrior, and would like to see peace. So Achilles at one point said, you know, that, you know, strife among, you know, men on the earth, human beings, would cease. So he wanted an end to all strife, you know, and this sounds like something from when I was in college, you know, in the 60s. But you know, Heraclitus criticizes Achilles for taking this point of view because he says we don't have stuff existing unless it's part of this strife between opposites. So he says in wishing that all strife or tension would cease, Achilles, without really knowing it, didn't realize that he was wishing for the destruction of the whole world order, you know, because the world order needs this tension, you know, in order to exist. So, as I said before, he uses the logos as the basic principle underlying, you know, this principle that things come into existence through strife and opposition in an ever-changing world order. And yeah, it is the word. You know, it's also used in the New Testament. And arche hein ho logos is the Greek. You know, in the beginning was the word, but given a very different meaning there. And so now this, we don't want to go really deeply into what he meant by logos, because here again, you can go farther than we really want. But basically, you know, for him, wisdom for a philosopher is understanding this insight that the logos, that this tension is behind what exists and necessary for the world order to exist. And it sounds like we need to tie things up. What time we got? Yeah. Well, it's 3:30. Let's see. Well, okay. I don't think your book, I gotta look at it again, goes much into Heraclitus ethics. Look at Parmenides next time, and maybe we'll have a little fun with, I think some of the paradoxes of Zeno are discussed. They're kind of fun to look at, and really, I mean, finding an adequate solution to some of Zeno's paradoxes wasn't really something that was done until you brought calculus into the picture. I mean, you know, and so at any rate, so we'll kind of pick up there, but go on to the next thing in the syllabus, past the Pre-Socratics, because we may. I'm sorry, my fault. I got over here. I forgot. Your printed syllabus is probably sitting over there in the print shop right now, because I took it in like what, Thursday, and so. But look at the online version, pass it out next time. I apologize. I forgot to go over it today. But if anyone came in after I called roll, let me know. But just go on, past the pre-Socratics, because I think we're going to go a little faster than I've got it down. Yeah.
I registered late. I sent you an email. My name is Brad. I'm not sure.
Okay. And I might not have. I haven't checked my email, my regular email today. So.
I registered late. So
Uh-huh.
I registered like a day or two ago.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I probably wouldn't be on.
Let me at least take your last name and your first name.
Okay, Bradley, B-R-A-D-L-E-Y.
Mm-hmm.
Stremple, S-T-R-I-M-P-L-E. I can give you my number too if you want.
Okay.
If you need it. It's 900-731-689.
Okay, and it's probably in there. I usually go in there and reprint one out, although we haven't had that many changes
Okay.
in this class. But,
So I haven't missed much yet then, I guess.
no,
First few classes.
the syllabus is online, and what I just apologize to them for is I had it printed out. They want us to either have it online or printed out, or both. I wanted to also get you a printout, but I forgot to go over there to the print shop. But it is online, and as well as the PowerPoints. So the PowerPoints are in a folder called PowerPoints in the
Is this all on like
course
Blackboard or
content.
something?
Yeah.
Blackboard?
Look in course content, then
Okay.
you'll see several folders. There's one that's labeled PowerPoints. But also on the left, I think there's a single one labeled syllabus, and you can look
All
at
right.
that.
Well.
But yeah, good to have you
All right.
in the class, and there's just one text, which is this one here,
Okay.
which they have, and it's actually a pretty readable, understandable text,
Okay.
compared to some of the ones that I've used.
All right.
Okay.
All right. Well, I
Yeah.
guess I'll see you on Thursday. Hopefully
Okay.
we have the things printed out. So.
Take care.